Hold on a second.
Yeah, no worries.
All right. Hey everybody, it's Jane Johnston with the BriarHillGroup at Remax, Mohsen, host of Vancouver Island Time and community talks every day at 4:30 live here on our web page or Facebook page. We're going to be talking today with Wade Patterson. Wade began his career with Remax in 2014. He left the world of journalism and joined Remax of Western Canada as a social media and communications coordinator. In 2018, Wade moved over to the Member Services Department and is currently a franchise development coordinator with the regional office. With a passion for innovation and creativity, Wade launched the Remax Hustle podcast in February 2019. He's hosted and produced more than 50 episodes, which is awesome, since then, and it has been streamed by listeners in over 50 countries. So how are you, Wade?
Hey, Jane, how are you doing? I remember it seems like not that long ago where we were sitting in Banff. I was interviewing you and you said, I'm going to get you on my show. So you did it. I'm here. How are you doing?
I'm awesome. It's funny, I read a post right at the beginning of the pandemic by this lady in Italy about how you will just embrace technology, then you'll want to break, and then you'll come back to it. And I find that's totally the case. How about you?
Yeah, absolutely. It's, as you can see, I'm in my living room office here. I had to try to find the nicest kind of background within my place, but I've been really impressed how everyone has adjusted so quickly. I mean, it was just boom. All of a sudden, offices were closed. People had to figure out solutions, and the amount of people who had never been on a Zoom call before that all of a sudden were on 3 to 4 per day and just embracing it. I think, as you said, we're all getting a little bit of that Zoom fatigue at this point, but it's been a great substitute for when we haven't been able to do as many in person. That technology has our back in this.
Right. And what I found amazing is I've actually gotten to know people across the world, specifically with Remax way better, because we've been collaborating on how to cope and strategies for coming back onto the market and marketing and all of that. So it's just been an incredible odyssey. And actually I have a post coming out on that. So question for you, coming from journalism, going into podcasting, what's been the main difference for you?
Yeah, it's a lot of the skills pertain still. So I studied journalism. I got my bachelor of journalism degree, and then I was a newspaper reporter. So print journalism. So I was used to going, interviewing someone. Typically we'd write 2 to 3 stories per day. Some of those stories would have more sources than others, but it would be a few interviews. I'd either use a recorder or take notes. I'd go back and then I'd be able to structure the story. So the biggest difference between podcasting is that it's a conversation either in person or virtually, but it's much more action in the moment. Print journalism, you can and ah and try to stumble your way through it because nobody's going to hear that recording except for me when I'm transcribing and writing the story. So there's a bit more pressure from that side of things. But at least the first year in doing the podcast, we've stuck to recorded interviews. So again, there's that leeway and that comfort because some people are really nervous. Even me before this, I don't get interviewed a lot, and it's a different feeling being interviewed. There's that feeling of pressure. And I think it's somewhat reassuring to someone to know, okay, if I stumble over a sentence in the editing process, we can fix this up a little bit. But with that said, and I mean, we're live today on Facebook and streaming in a few different places. It's still a great medium. I think that's what audiences crave as well. They want to see that raw interview live, that front row seat to the action kind of thing. So I think that there's a purpose for each different medium in the way you approach it. But in terms of journalism, the biggest benefit I took from it was, I think, the ability to ask good questions and listen to responses and then ask good follow-up questions from there.
Well, I remember when we were in Banff and you asked me to be on the Remax Hustle podcast, I said to you at the end, I said, oh, that's a bit nerve-wracking being on the receiving end.
Oh, you did great. You did great.
So, oh my goodness. Look at the side of my head is
That's why I don't do the virtual backgrounds. It must be my bald head or something, but I just blend right into them. So
okay, so I agree. Do you find like the types of questions, so you're asking more qualitative, open-ended questions than yes, no questions? That's a skill, right?
I think it is, yeah. And I like to structure my interviews so that I'm prepared going in. I think it's the way my brain works. And I learned this, actually, it's funny. So the first practicum experience I ever had, I was studying journalism at SAIT in Calgary, and I grew up in the town of Taber, Alberta. And I had a chance to go back and do a 2-week practicum program there. And so I was working for the local weekly newspaper, and I got to do some sports stories, which I preferred. But during that time, once a year, they'd put out an oil field supplement. And I know nothing about oil field or anything in that realm. So it was really beyond my expertise, but I was still expected, like every other staff reporter at a lot of these weekly newspapers, you have to adapt and be able to do stories in various, topics and that type of thing. So this oil field supplement, my editor told me that I needed to write an 800-word story interviewing a local businessman. And so I remember I thought, okay, what questions can I ask? And I came up with 6 questions. I'm like, hey, perfect. This will be great. And so I asked the first question once I met him face to face, and it was a yes or no question. And he's like, yes. I'm like, okay, down to 5 questions. And so I was like, so what have you learned throughout your years as this business owner and with everything that's happened in the oil field? And he said, oh, tons, too much to name. I'm like, all right, down to 4 questions. And I didn't have at that point
Tell me more about that.
the bravery or the courage, to ask a follow-up question, to really push the interviewee and say, can you expand a little bit on that? I was nervous. He was answering me. He looked annoyed that I was even doing this newspaper interview in the first place. And so I asked 6 questions, and his total responses were 10 words. And with my tail between my legs, I went back to the newspaper office, and I was so stressed out because I had to write an 800-word story. And so I had to explain to my editor, and thankfully he knew the guy, so he phoned him up and was able to get some quotes that I was able to use. But that was a lesson to me, to be prepared and to have more questions than you might need. Now, with that said, I think where I've grown in terms of interviewing people is that I've learned that sometimes you need to scrap that and go to the side or bounce around. So what you think the interview might look like, it might end up going in a completely different direction. And the audience will know if you have a question about one topic and then they give, let's say they tell a really heartfelt story that's kind of sad, and then you ask a question that is like funny or like a harsh transition out of that, it's not as an enjoyable experience to listen to. So that's always the challenge. And what I enjoy about interviewing someone is I've got my plan in place so that if I have no questions, I have things that I can fall back on that I prepared, but almost challenging myself when I'm in the interview to not have to refer to that paper and try to make it as natural a conversation as possible.
Yeah, and I think when people are listening to, they also have a question that they're asking in their head. Like I noticed when I listen to Oprah, I'm thinking, okay, well, this is the next question. And then she asks it, and I think, okay, that's intuition almost, I think, on her part of being such a skilled interviewer. And I think, so it's interesting what you're talking about, being in journalism and then asked to write a story on the oil fields. for me, it was the same. I was a teacher and I had to go work in the library, and my background was phys ed and science, and I had to learn to operate computers quite quickly and do all the presentations. So you just have to be adaptable. That being said, I also spent a year just focusing on open-ended questions because I felt as a teacher, if I wanted to draw out, especially in the health sciences, issues with my students, it would be advantageous for me to ask the open-ended questions. And it's really helped being a realtor because now, like for instance, the other day I asked some open-ended questions and I found out that a listing I have had a major avalanche a few years ago, and but they fixed it. But they didn't tell me that every other time I've met with them. So it's more about asking and then finding out and then going on from there. So do you find now, like, do you have difficult interviewees pulling the information, or are you more skilled at doing that?
There are like difficult people to interview. Have I run into that? Is that what you're wondering?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not going to name them. No, nobody on the Remax Hustle podcast. And I genuinely mean that. I mean, everyone, the whole premise of that podcast is interviewing people who have done something in real estate that is unique, or they have tools or ideas to share. And that's the great thing about Remax, honestly, is that everyone is so willing to share their experience, their expertise, what works. Nobody holds it close to their chest. They're willing to better the industry, really. And so, especially if you're able to identify that, and that's, I guess, one reason why it's nice when you can to have a pre-interview call, or even just chat a little bit beforehand, even if it's through email or text, and discuss a little bit about what they would like to talk about on the interview. I never like to fully allow the guests to control all of the questions, or even sometimes I've had guests bring in a piece of paper. And what I like to do, if that's the case, because they'll have all their answers written of what we talked about. So I'll take the piece of paper and I'll be like, what does this say? And then they'll start like telling me word for word what's on here. I'm like, okay, cool. So you don't need this. So I'll just get rid of the piece of paper. And I find that, especially with a podcast, if you can make it more conversational, it's just a more enjoyable experience. I mean, people are sitting in their vehicles, they're at the gym, and have you in their headphones. It's a nice conversation experience if it seems more natural rather than scripted answers.
Yes, I agree. And I also agree about the scripting versus non-scripting. You are probably the most scripted person I've had an interview with. That being said, Sarah Kalki is also very scripted, and I think it's wise, but I think also you have to listen and be adaptable. And I think what it does is it gives you a predictable interview, but maybe not the best interesting interview, right?
Yeah, well, and that's the thing. I think it's got to be a mix of both. For me, I like having that structure, and I put thought into the ordering of the questions and that kind of thing, because I think there's a bit of predictability of how a conversation is going to flow. I mean, if I do a bio where I introduce you, Jane, to the podcast and I talk about your background, then it's natural to ask a question of, oh, so you were a teacher before. So what was that experience like? How has that impacted real estate? And then if I'm predicting what's going to be next, perhaps you talk about that background teaching. And then I say, so how long did it take to get traction within the industry? And I can start to build out those questions, kind of guessing where the conversation is going to go. But each conversation is different. Each interview is different. Where it goes is, you've got to be ready, as we've talked about, to adapt to the conversation.
So did you move into podcasting as opposed to video just because of your comfort level with journalism and or like, what was the reason for you choosing podcasting? Because Kingsley chose video, and I was trying to tell him last week, it's okay for the two to overlap, because you each have different personalities and people are going to be attracted to you for different reasons. But what made you choose podcasting?
Yeah, great question, Jane. I think for me, I had this aha moment with podcasting. So I had friends who would talk about how they were really into podcasts. I never really got it. To be completely honest, I didn't really know what a podcast was for a long time. Like, all these people were using it, and I'm like, I know what that is, but I didn't actually realize what my Apple Podcast or Spotify app could do in that sense. But I was traveling for work, and I remember it really clearly. I was on a flight and I was scrolling through my songs. So I had my whole library of songs just on random. And it must have been like 15 minutes straight where I just next. I was so sick of my own music, and I was just like tired sitting in this flight. I'm like, I don't want to listen to any more random music. And so when we got to the next airport, because it was one of those where you have the layover in between, I started looking into podcasts. I found that little podcast app on my iPhone, and then I downloaded, I think the first one I downloaded was a Gary Vaynerchuk and maybe a Joe Rogan and a couple like that. And then on the flight, the next flight, I listened to these, and it was, for me, it was this aha moment of like, wow, like I'm bettering myself right now sitting here. I'm not just listening to mindless music. I'm actually learning something. And especially then when I got back home, I'd be listening to podcasts on drives, again, educating myself while I'm just wasting time, I guess, or at the gym. Not only am I working out, but I'm learning something as well. So for me, I've been really fascinated. And I think the idea of podcasting, attention is a really hard thing to get these days. I mean, even videos, if we're scrolling through social media and I see a video that's a couple minutes long, I'm like, do I want to waste my 2 minutes of my day watching this? But with podcasts, they're rare in the sense that they're this medium that people will listen to a 30-minute, a 1 hour, a 3-hour podcast from start to finish. And it won't be done in one sitting, right? This will be little chunks that they pick up, and it might take a full week or 2 weeks, but people will listen from start to finish if they're enjoying the content. And I just thought that that was such a cool opportunity. And then the second part to that, we have regional management training at our office. I mean, not now during these specific times, but typically 3 times a year, where all of our new brokers and managers come to Kelowna. We give them kind of a deep dive in managing or owning a franchise. And this was a couple of years ago, an attendee who said, it's great that you guys are doing blog posts that are training and videos and all these different things, but have you thought of doing any audio training? Because there's so many agents who are in their vehicles so often, and this might be another way to connect. And it was a really good point. And so we had started to look into that. So I decided in early 2019, I knew nothing about actually running a podcast. Pardon me. So I decided to just learn the school of YouTube. There's so much information there. I knew a couple other people here in Kelowna who are doing podcasts. I sat down with them. They taught me what they knew. And I think early on, I just didn't want to bite off more than I could chew, because I think people who do podcasts and incorporate video, that's where I'm aspiring to be honest. We've started to incorporate that a little bit more this year. I think it's definitely advantageous to do that. And then we talk about layering content. One interview could be 5, 10, 15 pieces of content. I think that's hugely beneficial. But to answer your question, that's initially what drew me into podcasts specifically.
What I find too, like the evergreening of the content and repurposing it, and then you could use it in blogs, is if you look at it from a teaching perspective, everybody has different learning styles. So I'm in a course right now and it has a lot of audio, and I'm like, but what I do, because I'm a kinesthetic learner, is I write down. I've learned I have to get my iPad out and write down notes so that I'm actively listening. So we just adapt. And I find, I listen a lot to the radio, which is a podcast, and then they're highlighting podcasts on the radio. And actually I was listening to a podcast the other day, and they made a really good point. We're in an era right now where professionals are running their shows off of their iPhones out of their houses. We are all on the same page right now.
100%.
Like, what an opportunity, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, even you look at some of these late night shows and something like Jimmy Fallon or Jimmy Kimmel, and they have continued to make the show go on, but he doesn't have a whole crew at his house. He has just been doing that. I mean, he has the help of his daughters and his wife and that kind of thing, but they're putting a show together with minimal equipment. Of course, then they'll send it to an editing team, I'm sure, over email and that type of thing. But you're absolutely right. I mean, with how far technology has come and apps like, I'm not sure what you use specifically for uploading your podcasts. We use a website called Anchor. And I mean, it's literally drag and drop the audio file, give it a title, add an episode description, and it gives you crazy good analytics. And it's on Spotify and Apple Podcasts within 5 minutes usually. It doesn't get much easier than that.
Do you look at the stats as they come in? We do.
Yeah, I'm always really curious, especially early on, because I had done a bit of research on kind of the value of podcasts and that kind of thing. But of course, you want it to actually be listened to and know where your listeners are coming from. And our audience is obviously Western Canada agents and brokers. That's the focus. But the spin-off benefit, and you alluded to this in the bio, is that people from, I'm assuming from Remax, but from all over the world have started listening. That's not the majority of our listeners. That's a very small fraction, like probably under 3% of the listeners. But it's 50 different countries that at some point people have listened to the podcast from. And then also a pretty good chunk in the US. So I think we're about 70 to 75% Western Canada, 5% Eastern Canada, and then like 20% US or something like that as well. So
how many downloads have you had? Do you know?
So we've done 53 episodes. I think we're around 15,000 downloads. So it's not like per episode. I'm not sure what the math is on that, but it's good. And one of the things I've noticed is that keeps growing. So we could not download an episode or upload an episode for a couple of months, and the numbers continue to go, because just because you post a new episode that day doesn't mean everyone's going to listen to it that day. And we find that episode 1, which was the first one we did with Elton Ash, that one has the highest listens, which I think is common for podcasting, which is interesting, right? So, I mean, a lot of times you're balancing between, you want to have a really good product when you start, but at the same time, if you're always waiting for it to be perfect, you'll never actually get going. But it's worth knowing that if you do launch a podcast, that first episode probably will get listened to more than the others. So, you know, you want to maybe make sure it's at a certain level of quality before you jump right in, because people might judge that podcast based on that first episode. But it continues to grow over time. And so, you know, while one person who had never heard of the podcast might see somebody else share it and they catch episode 40, who knows, if they really like it, they might go back to number 1 and start listening all the way through.
Well, the other thing is, you know, you can record your first, it's recommended you record your first 3 or 4 podcasts before you actually do your first one, before you release them all. So you can choose which one you want to have as your first podcast.
That's a great tip. That I didn't do that. I wish I had. Well, I shouldn't say that, because Elton was the first interview and I think he did a great job on it. And obviously, I mean, that's the highest listened to, and then a lot of people continue to listen from there. But that's a really good idea. And just in general, having a few episodes in the can, as they say, so that if you ever run into an issue where, like, it's very difficult to say, okay, every week I need to find somebody to interview and then I need to post a podcast that week, especially if you have like a day, like podcasts come out every Thursday or something like that. I think it's always a good idea to be sitting on a couple, but with what we've seen in the last couple months, things change quickly too. So you got to always be mindful of timeliness as well.
Right. Have you ever had a podcast that didn't work out? You had to redo it?
Oh, yes, I did recently. So I hauled all of this podcast equipment to my place. This was in mid-March that we closed our office at Remax Western Canada. And so I thought, hey, might as well take the podcast equipment home, be able to still do episodes remotely, which has worked really well. I had the chance to talk to Jesse Peters out of Winnipeg, he's a friend of mine. I've gotten to know him through some of the video boot camp things, along with Michael Thorne. And I was interviewing Jesse, and it was a great conversation. Jesse had provided a ton of value. And then I look at the website we're using, Zencaster, and I'm like, something doesn't look right. And there's still that record button that hasn't been pressed. And we're probably 25 minutes in. And I'm like,
I did that.
Oh no. So tell me, what happened in your circumstance? I mean, did the guest freak out? How did you break the news to them?
Well, I'd done it previous.
Okay.
And
Are we recording this one, Jane? Are we sure about
I am.
this?
I just checked.
Okay, good. Okay. I don't mind doing it again.
But so when it happened, I went to press stop and I was like, oh my God. And you know that feeling when your stomach drops. So then I thought, okay, I said, okay, you guys, it was a cross-country market update with realtors all across Canada. And there were 8 of us on the original call. And I told them all, I said, oh my, I'm so sorry. I forgot to record. So we did it. But what happened was the second one was way better because we were way more succinct, way more.
Well, there you go. And that's the bright. So actually going back to this Jesse story. So first off, I'm in that moment and Jesse had just finished this like really passionate answer. And I'm just like, hey, Jesse, I don't know how to tell you this. I didn't press record. And then he's just like, what? I'm like, I haven't recorded any of this. And he's just, but he burst out laughing and he's like, dude, he's like, it's all good. We can do this another time. It actually worked out for the best. Just like you said, he was using, I think he had like AirPods or something like that. But Jesse's one of those guys who produces really good quality video. And one of the things that was bothering me during the conversation is I thought, this interview is not doing him justice because he makes great video, but the audio on this interview isn't fantastic. And he had another mic. He just hadn't brought it to the office that day. So when we were able to re-record a couple weeks later, he had that professional mic and it ended up being, I would agree, a better conversation. But man, it is not a fun feeling when you realize that you haven't hit record. So
You let yourself and everybody down.
Exactly. But people are forgiving. I mean, people understand, they sympathize. And again, I've never run into a situation where somebody is so, I don't know the word, arrogant on their own time that they're not willing to give you another go at it and that type of thing. People are really forgiving and understanding. So
do you have a script that you like? You were talking about your basic questions. Do you have basic questions you ask everybody, or do you have questions that person, based on what you know, prompts you to ask certain questions?
every interview I do has a similar structure. So I read in a bio for the guest, and then often the first question has something to do with either background from the bio I just read or walk us down the path of how you got into real estate. That's often a first question. Then it's completely different for every other person based on what they're there to talk about. But I always end with our patented, what is your Remax hustle tip question? Podcasts I listen to that have some sort of continuing question, there's something you look forward to. Like there's different ones. Some people are like, hey, we're going to give you a rapid 5 questions and or something like that. And I just think it's, especially for those dedicated listeners that tune into every episode, it's fun to hear how different people have answered. And then going forward, you're kind of building a library of, hustle tips. Now that we've done 50 interviews, we've had 50 different tips on how you accomplish a task when you need to get something done. So I haven't fully thought about maybe how we can leverage that, but maybe there's something there down the road where we can talk about, here's the hustle tips from X number of interviews and find themes and similarities.
Yeah, or you could go into that more in depth. I believe mine was listen.
That is a good one. Especially if you're interviewing other people, right? And because we're always so focused about what it is that we're going to say next. And so sometimes we're not really paying attention to what the other person's saying. And that gets back into what we were talking about asking good questions and trying to avoid those harsh transitions. I mean, I've seen some awkward interviews where somebody, they're almost in tears telling a story, and then somebody's sticking to the script and they just ask a really inappropriate question and it never goes over well.
Actually, I remember the other tip. When we did the podcast interview, the tip was do what you don't want to do first, that you get through that. But when we did the interview on the panel, it was to listen. And I think that's probably a skill everybody needs to work on.
100%. Yeah, exactly. And that other one you mentioned is so good as well, of tackling that that challenging thing, or else it's just going to linger all day. It's in the back of your mind. And if you attack it first, you get it out of the way. And usually it's not as bad as we build it up to be anyways.
Exactly. Okay. So tell me about how this being on a podcast has affected how you're perceived as a professional. I'm very interested to know, because I think it elevates people as on the stage.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I'm not 100% sure, but sometimes I think, because I'll go a while and not hear anybody talk about the podcast and stuff like that. But then I was kind of blown away at Activate, because we see our numbers, like we know people are listening, but at Activate, I had conversations with people and they were like, I listen to every episode, or some brokers who are like, I always send this to my agents to listen to as well. Like, I love it. So I definitely think that it makes an impact. I don't know how I'm perceived in a different way. I mean, my goal is to kind of get out of the way of the conversation. I want to help facilitate a good conversation. And I think I've heard you say this before, Jane, is a good interviewer, you want to allow your guests to shine and allow them to be able to really focus. And I remember there was, what was the circumstance? Might have been a panel or something. Yeah, it was a panel at an event. And this was a bunch of years ago when I first joined Remax. And the panelist who was doing, like, there was 3 panelists and there was a moderator, and the moderator probably did 80% of the talking, like, total. And then the 3 panelists did about 20%. And I remember the panelists, just, you could tell by their faces, they weren't thrilled about how this was going. The audience was, we get it. You may be experienced as well, but in this role, you're the moderator of the conversation. So, I mean, that's my biggest goal on these podcasts, is try my best to actually feature those people. I don't need to, it's a good conversation when you can add in stories and anecdotes that flow well. But if I'm sitting there talking for 20 minutes and the other person's only talked for 5, in my opinion, usually that's not a good interview.
Yeah, what I find when I listen to interviews like that, I just get really frustrated. It's like, just let the guy talk.
Exactly.
Okay, best guest that you ever had?
JaneJohnston.
Oh, thanks.
Next question. You know what? There has been so many good ones. The one that I maybe was most excited about was, it actually happened over this global pandemic time. And I had an idea early on that we should do our best to start reaching out to keynote speakers who maybe we wouldn't be able to normally get. So if in the past, I have interviewed a couple people who had been speakers at Remax conferences, but rarely, only in one instance was I able to reach out to somebody who had never been a speaker at one of our conferences and just say, hey, do you just want to be on this podcast? And they did it, which was very nice. But you get a lot of no's for those, or just you don't hear back kind of thing. But I reached out to Scott Stratton, and he's someone, he had spoken at Remax conference, but that's going way back. I think it was 2013 or something like that. And I've really liked what he has to talk about. He has this brand, Unmarketing, where he talks about, you want to engage, not just sell to people kind of thing, be a human first. And the timing of that was early days in this. And it was about a 40-minute conversation. And going through the editing process, I always do my best to edit out things like breath noise and like ums and ahs. I'm just particular that way. I don't know. But with Scott, it was so minor editing. Like, I just listened basically. And like the odd thing, I just like tweak a little bit. But other than that, it was so smooth to listen to. And so I really enjoyed doing that. But all of the guests genuinely have brought, like, there's not an episode where I was like, oh, we can't post this. It's not like, every episode's been really good.
Right. And I just want to say, actually, regarding podcasting and just filming it, even just doing it like this, like, I watch my son on video games and I think it's the most boring thing, but he's totally enamored. And I figure if an 18-year-old is totally enamored and can watch, then 100%. Why not just film it?
Exactly. Yeah. And that's one thing I think is so smart. Again, there's no, we talk about video and podcasting and one or the other. And we've started to, when we have the live in-person interviews, and we did a few of those in January and February, we did record them and then like videoed them. And then we did little like 1-minute clips for Instagram, answering a question kind of thing to help promote the episode. But down the road, I think there's definitely room for maybe live streaming, that kind of thing. Cause you're right. I mean, you might as well, you're interviewing the person anyways, might as well get as many pieces of content as possible.
Well, and also I think, I can't remember, it's like 86% or something of communication is nonverbal. So, you know, right now I'm looking in the camera, but I'm not looking at you. I'm actually looking at you when I'm doing this. And
Yeah.
I'm locked in on your eyes and reading what your facial expressions are. So for me, it's a very visual experience I like to watch.
That's a really good point. And absolutely, I mean, the actual words people say are something like 7% of communication, like it's verbal tone and it's body language. And that's a good point. That has been a bit of a challenge, especially when we're doing remote interviews. We use a website called Zencaster, and it's just all audio. So you're really relying on tone of voice, and it's tougher. Like it is more difficult. There's been a couple interviews where I was like, oh, is the guest even enjoying this experience? And then at the end, they're like, that was great. Thanks so much. And I was like, really? Like, I had no idea. But if I was in person, I'd probably be able to detect that a bit more. One of the tips I heard really early on from this, it was kind of like a how to podcast that you could listen to about, you know, for aspiring podcasters, is they said, if it's all audio, even if it is and nobody can see you, still smile when you talk, because somehow people can hear that in your voice as well. So little tip for those who are doing podcasts.
So I was on a podcast in the morning. These friends of mine do something on Instagram, and they're very, very nurturing. So they're slow talkers, and there's a lot of, you know, and I just thought, that is so not me, but I am just going to enjoy it.
There you go. Yeah. And Jane, I've been so impressed. You're doing so many of these. I mean, it's such a cool thing to see some of these interviews, to hear them. But yeah, each one has a bit of a different style. And that's another thing to be mindful of. If you're interviewing somebody and it's audio only, there's a lot of things we do in a normal conversation to almost encourage the other person. So like the little sounds like, yeah, those types of things, like the little sounds to keep them going in the conversation. On a podcast, unless you're editing that out, it can be really distracting, especially if you're doing something remote and they're getting that noise a couple seconds later in their headphones. So one of the biggest challenges for me getting into podcasting has been talk and then shut up. Like I can laugh and things like that and engage, but it's not adding in all those little noises that seem so natural.
I agree. And I find, there's a big back there, but I agree. I just listen now a lot and encourage with my face.
Exactly.
And I happen to have really white teeth for some reason.
There you go.
Okay. So what is your Remax hustle tip for podcasting?
Oh, that is such a good question.
Good.
I think preparation for me is a big one. So do the research, right? Research your subject. I think another thing that is really key is I love introducing the person, reading their bio. Where this goes back to is I used to be a big fan of The Hour with George Stropolopoulos and a couple other of these CBC interview programs. And they did the coolest bio intros on their guests. It was like a 2-minute video that was such a deep dive. And in almost every instance, the guest came in and they're like, wow, like, where did you find all this information on me? And if you can set the tone, and it doesn't have to be to that level. I've had that comment even when I went to that person's website and copy pasted their own pre-written bio, but I just read it. Because what I found is in a lot of interviews, people start off with, okay, please introduce yourself. Tell us. And people are a little bit like, they're modest. They don't want to brag about themselves, that kind of thing. And so if you as the host are validating that person before they even talk, it's just, It's setting the tone for the interview. And I think it's a nice way to start it off. So that's my one tip, but there's so many different ones, like little ones here and there, but I think that's the biggest thing. And then have some sort of structure. So I like to start every episode the same. I like to end every episode with the same. And then in the middle is where I get to mix it up depending on the guest.
I find also you get a rhythm doing it. So,
Mm-hmm.
you start, my cousin who's in broadcasting in England asked me, did you take training on this? You're so polished. I'm like, well, if you say the same thing, 100 times.
Exactly.
It does get polished.
Well, and I go back to being a listener of podcasts and I enjoy it. Like there's the podcasts I listen to religiously. I know what the host is going to say right at the top of the episode. And I almost like, it sounds geeky, but you kind of like look forward to like, oh, I wonder what this person's answers for the last question are going to be. Cause every episode is going to come back to that. So.
Yeah. And actually Kingsley does a values introduction, which I thought was a really good idea. And I was promising myself I was going to do that, but like 90% of people haven't done it yet. So I'm working on that. And also the outro, right? And talking about what's coming up, and it can be very blueprinted if you want it to be, right?
One of the things I was blown away by, Jane, I think you were mentioning this in another video, is the fact that you've been able to attribute real business and real numbers to, like, there's been business that's come off of this as well, which is awesome. Like, I mean, that's just I don't think it should necessarily be the primary reason you get into it, but the fact you're having that spin-off benefit. Can I ask you, I just want to flip the script for a second, but like, what has your experience been from that side of things?
Oh, it's hilarious because, first of all, I've gone to the Remax conference and people have said, Jane, and I'm like, I don't know you. So they've been watching the videos. Today, I texted somebody a happy birthday and he said he's been watching me online. He's not a client of mine, but in terms of the business itself, what I'm finding is people come up and they know all my mannerisms. They know I'm quirky and I have a good sense of humor. But that's what they tell me anyway. I don't know.
You do, absolutely.
And I'm not. So in terms of actual measurable business, I know it's been over $100,000 of income, direct income, that I can measure. Obviously.
In how long of a time period?
I've been doing it since probably February 2018, and we've done 80 episodes, and we've only had 6,000 downloads, but we do a lot on, that's just audio downloads. And actually, now that I think about it, we moved, that's since last September. Because
Wow.
We moved from under the umbrella of another corporation to just our own. So we've had 6,000 downloads since September.
That's
I was
fantastic.
thinking that's a low number compared to Wade's.
No, but, and also, I mean, it has nothing to do with me. It's everything with Remax and the fact it's Western Canada. I mean, there's more than 6,000 affiliates in Western Canada, right?
No, it's okay.
I would hope those numbers would be higher.
No, actually, it's funny. I was talking in another group about you being interviewed, and somebody in the US was saying they're like really high on technology side of things, and they were saying they listen to you. So I'm not surprised because the people in Remax are really they love the brand. So the Remax hustle, they're going to just buy into that 100%.
Yeah. Well, and the US Remax LLC was really pushing that Remax hustle kind of hashtag on social media and stuff. So we're like, we want to grab it and steal it for the podcast. So
yeah.
It's worked out.
So regarding the statistics, one of the reasons why we moved to our own platform and we use Spreaker, I like the statistics, but when I was under the umbrella of somebody else, I couldn't see my own stats. So then we went under our own. I've heard Anchor is really easy. Podbean, anybody else who you've heard who are really easy to use?
The first one I was recommended was one called Libsyn, Libsyn. And I think that's a subscription cost. So it's something like $20 a month. And there may be features that Libsyn has that Anchor does not, but for what I needed it for, I actually found Anchor was a better user interface and that type of thing. So Anchor's been great for me. And the analytics, I mean, you can get pretty narrow or specific. Like we could go by city. You don't have, it's not just Western Canada. It's like BC, and then you can get more granular. And it tells you percentage that's female, percentage that's male, all like stats that I don't even know that you need that many stats, but the fact that they're all there, it's really interesting. And the other one I like is where they're listening to it. So the majority of ours are on Apple Podcasts, then the website directly, then Spotify. So I would have thought Spotify would be bigger.
For anybody who's not doing a podcast right now, just so you know, you stick it on the platform and then they disseminate it. Like it's done for you, right? So easy.
Exactly. Well, and that's the thing. And I've heard of other ones like before Anchor and before Libsyn, perhaps some of the, like you had to use to take a RSS feed or some sort of piece of code and then put it all the, like that's beyond my technical knowledge. So the fact I can just drag and drop a piece of audio makes it really easy.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. So I think we're going to close out now. Is there anything else you want to say to people who may be contemplating doing a podcast, but have not yet taken the leap?
Honestly, if you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I've had that in a few instances of people wondering about equipment or wondering about, what we were just talking about, syndicating them to the different platforms or setting up an Anchor account, or, hey, the intro sounds cool. How do I get my own intro done? Should I do a commercial? All those types of things. I was very lucky because I was able to benefit off of other people who had taken that path before me and had banged their head against the wall many times in order to figure out certain things. And they saved me all that hassle. And so I'm happy to help out anyone who has any questions. Okay.
And so if you're in real estate, you can join the Real Estate Podcasters group. It's free, and ask all those sorts of questions. It's really simple. You guys just start doing it. If you're not in real estate, because this is being streamed on my regular page, podcasting is a really, really easy way to get your name out there. It's not stressful. The only hard thing I found is actually getting the guests, but they always seem to materialize in time. So, okay. So thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate it. And I found this interview way better with me being the interview.
Exactly. You crushed it as interviewer. Jane, thanks so much for the opportunity. This was a ton of fun. Really appreciate it.
Okay. Take care, everybody. See you later.
Bye. Bye.